Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of .NET MAUI 101. In this episode, I'm going to talk all about control reference binding. So I'm not really sure if this is the correct term for it or if there is even a correct term for this, but what is going to happen, what you're going to see in this video is how I'm going to reference one control to another in pure XAML, so you don't need to do any code basically, and you can reference and data bind to properties between those controls. So you can influence the behavior of one control just by pointing to the property of another control. Now, it sounds a little bit abstract, so let's just dive into the code and see what it's all about. So here we are in Visual Studio 2022. This is just a file new .NET MAUI application, fresh out of the box, a new project. You can see here all the basic ingredients that it has: the scroll view, a vertical stack layout, an image, a label, all those kinds of things. And here, just above the button, I'm going to add a new thing, which is the switch. So we have the little switch here, and with the switch you get that little toggle that you can enable and you can disable. And wouldn't it be cool if we could just use that to enable and disable the button? Now, usually what you might do is say is toggled, and then you go with data binding, like binding to some kind of backing field in your view model, and then in your button you're also going to pick up that property and it will enable and disable depending on the value of that binding on the view model. But that's a lot of stuff to implement just to, influence that behavior of another control. That's right there. It's right there. So we're not going to do any of that. I'm actually not even going to touch the is toggled right here. What I want to do here is give this an X name. So we give this a reference, and I'm going to call this enabled switch. And now our switch is done. So with this X name, you just give this control a name, which you can reference it by. In the background, it will generate some C# code, and it will generate this variable name for us. So you can also use it in the code behind if that's what you want. But we're not going to do that. What we're going to do now on this button is just say, hey, I have this is enabled, and I'm going to say still binding. I'm going to say is toggled. So this is going to be the name of the property that you want to bind to. In this case, from our switch, we have a property here, which is called is toggled. And I'm going to set the path for this, or well, the source actually, this is the path. So if you don't set a path for the binding here, this is basically a shorthand for path is. And I'm going to set the source because typically it will just look at the binding context for our whole page, right? But in this case, I'm going to specify a source, and for just this property, this binding right here, I'm going to point it at a specific source, which is going to be our switch. So let's say source, and then I need to do extra curly brackets. And then I'm going to say X reference. And with X reference, I can reference another variable. It doesn't even have to be a control. You can reference it to other things as well. It can also be a resource in your resource dictionary. So I'm going to say X reference, and you can see that already the IntelliSense comes up here, and it helps me with the enabled switch. So now it's going to look in the source, the enabled switch for the is toggled, and that's going to be applied to the is enabled for this button. So if I run this application, it's going to be deployed to my Windows machine. Of course, this all lives in XAML, so in the abstract layer of .NET MAUI. So this also works for Android, iOS, out of the box, all the platforms that are supported for .NET MAUI, but I'm going to show you this on Windows just because it's the easiest thing to do right now. And here we are, the application is coming up. So let's see what is going to happen here, if this actually works, if I'm not telling you any nonsense right here. Come on, app, come up here. Here we are. And whenever we see, you can already see that the button is off, right? The toggle is off. So the button is actually already disabled. And when I switch this to on, the layout could be a little bit better. But now you can see that it flips on, and I can do the click me button. And if I flip it back, then you see it disables again. And that's how the control references work. That's it. Another episode of .NET MAUI 101. You've now learned how to influence the behavior of different controls. Of course, this is just a very simple example, but you can come up with more complex samples. Maybe your control needs validation, and whenever it's not validated, then the button is going to be disabled. That's just one that comes to mind right here. Thanks so much for watching again one of the episodes. You can find the full playlist of .NET MAUI 101s right here, or if you want to know a little bit more about .NET MAUI as a whole, the playlist is here, and please click this button to be subscribed. See you for the next one.